Hey everybody, it is Coach Malcolm here today, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different here because it occurred to me that for our, the more beginner players at home, school had to shut down, very unfortunate, but you may not have gotten the chance to learn notation, or maybe you started learning notation, but you weren't in chess club anymore, in person, physically, and you sort of forgot. So in my lesson today, I'm going to be telling you guys just the most basic ways to do notation. And if you're asking yourself what even is notation, notation is the way that we record chess games. So when you see the games that other coaches have put in their videos, all those games between grandmasters and even just players who are a whole range of ratings, those games that have already occurred, but we're able to look through them, that's because of notation. And notation is also super important because the way that you learn from your games, you learn what you did good, you learn what you did bad, you learn about your opponent's moves, their openings, their ideas, is you go after your games to get your notation looked at with your coach. So if you want to work on your notation skills, if you don't know any notation at all, stick with this, and we are going to look at that right away. So what is notation, right? Notation is, like I said, we're recording our moves, and each piece has a different way to record moves. And the format that we have, if you look on the right side of the screen, is you say the piece, you say the letter, and then you say the number. Okay, so I'm going to explain exactly what this means. So let's start with the piece aspect. Okay, I'm going to head on over here, and here we have some images, right? Some awesome images of our pieces, and then the way they're spelled, because the way that we write out a piece is with almost always the first letter in the spelling. So let's start with the king. King is spelled K-I-N-G, right? So the way that we start off for a king move is we put K. So when you see in a notation sheet or on the sidebar, if you're looking at an online game and you see K, that means we are looking at a king move, right? K for king. The same, queen is Q, rook is R, bishop is B, and knight, the thing about knight is a bit of an exception, and that's because knight also starts with K, right? It's a bit of a silent K, but we don't want to start knight and king both with K because then it would be very confusing and we wouldn't really know which one we were talking about in some cases. So we're going to write knight with an N, which is easy to remember because when you say it in your head or when you say it out loud, it sounds like it starts with an N, not with a K. And then pawn, we're actually going to have another exception. We're not going to write P, but I'll explain that when we get to the board because it's easier to understand. So we've gotten past this first part, right? Piece, we put the letter. Let's say we were starting with the queen, Q. Okay? Now, in terms of the squares on the board, right? A chessboard has 64 squares. And I like to think of writing down notation and identifying, different squares across the board as playing Battleship. So I hope a number of you guys have played Battleship because that'll make this analogy much easier to understand. So how does Battleship work? When you pick a square, you have to go up or down and then side to side and find out what the coordinate of the square is, right? And they'll line up like we see here. So let's take this square right here, an unknown square right now. But if we travel all the way down to the board, we get to this letter right here, D, right? So that's our letter, right? So let's just put a D here for now. Now, if we travel all the way across the board, what do we have arrived at? We've arrived at 5, and that is our number, okay? So when I say piece, that means we are using almost always the first letter of our pieces. When I say letter, it means we are using these letters on the bottom of the board. They're on every file, right? A, B, A to H. Each file has a different letter associated with it. So when you have a piece, let's say your knight is here, your knight is on F5, right? So how would we write some moves, right? Because the best way we can try and understand this is with practice, right? So I'm going to erase this right here. We know that we have to go piece, letter, and then number, right? So let's start with just a basic knight move, right? What do we start our knight with? Like we said, we start knight with N. And your pieces, your bishops, your knights, your rooks, your queens, your kings, you're going to capitalize that first letter, okay? So we start off with N, and now let's find out where this knight is exactly, right? So we travel all the way down. What file is he located on? F, right? And then if we travel across, that knight is on the 3rd rank, right? So what is our letter? F. We're going to make this lowercase. And then our number, like we said, is 3. So we don't need these dashes, obviously. When you notate, you will take those out. And here is our first notated move of the video. Let me get rid of this. Knight to f3. And that is how we notate a move. But let's try some more, right? I'm just going to play some random moves for a second. Let's say we want to try and move this bishop, right? And we're going to move this bishop here. So we know that bishop starts with, let me move this over so we can see. Give me 1 second. Here we go. So we know bishop starts with a B, right? So we're going to start off with our B letter. And now let's find out what square this is, right? We travel down on the file. There we go. We have a G, right? We travel over on the rank and we have the number 2. So bishop G2 is exactly how we would record that move, right? If we wanted to move our rook, let's say we go right on over here. I wouldn't recommend it because we usually want a castle, which we'll get in how to notate in a second. But we've got our R for rook. Oh, we don't even have to travel anywhere. He's already seated on F. And then we travel over and we've got R1. So that is rook F1. Okay? Like I said, let's say we wanted to do a move for black. Test out with the queen. We've got Q for queen. Where is this queen located? Let's travel all the way down on the D file. Travel all the way across on the 6th rank. Okay? So always piece, letter, number. Okay? And now you remember I said that pawns are a bit of an exception. So what do I mean? For your pawns, instead of saying P, usually if we were using this, we would say P, right? Because pawn, which we're going to come back to. And this pawn, we travel all the way down, E, and then we travel all the way across, 4, right? So we would say pawn E4. And people write this in their notation, and it's not, when your coaches read over this or anyone reads over this, they'll understand what a person is trying to say. But for pawns, we don't need this P in place, right? We're going to take that P out, and we are just going to write the move E4. So let's say a move like this. Pause your videos if you want to try and figure this move out on your own. But we're going to go through it, travel all the way down. B, we'll start off right with the letter for our pawns, travel all the way across the rank, B5, right? And that will be our move for our pawn, okay? So, like I said, R for rook, N for knight, B for bishop, Q for queen, K for king, and unfortunately for the pawn, the pawns are, I guess you could say, they're not as important pieces, even though they're very key to a number of games. They are not going to get that P for pawn. And then in terms of our squares, it is all about playing battleship on the chessboard, finding a random square, traveling down. Here we've got C, traveling over 5. This is C5. So always our formula is piece, letter, number. Now, let's spice it up a little bit, right? Because there's some more things that happen in a chess game. So over here, you might have noticed my super sneaky box. Here we go. We got it out of the way. I have a few more chess moves that we need to be able to notate, right? So a check is a plus sign. And you might be asking, well, let's focus on these 3 first, okay? We'll come to castling in a minute, I promise. But let's focus on these 3 first, okay? So these are all symbols to explain what is happening in a game. Castles king side and castles queen side are moves. These are, explaining more about what is specifically happening in a game. So check, we are just going to have a plus symbol. And you might be saying, where does that plus symbol go? Let's take this move right here. Bishop. And let's travel down. B5, okay? Bishop B5. So we've got bishop B5. You'll see it written right here as well. Bishop B5. And now this king is in check, right? We know we have our check. And if you look right in here, it might be a little hard to see. There's a plus sign. So for check, at the end of the move, you put a plus sign, and that means it is a check, okay? Now, for checkmate, you might have noticed, you can call this whatever you want. Hashtag, pound, a number sign. Regardless, checkmate is going to be written the same way. So just to make this easy, let us look at the 4-move checkmate. Now, so we've seen our moves. Bishop C4, right? Just to get this practice in. And queen F3. And now we're actually going to get 2 birds with 1 stone. We are going to look at how to write captures and how to write checkmate, okay? So here, white to move, our checkmate, we should know this. Mate, this is a classic scholar's mate. Queen takes F7 is checkmate. So how do we write captures? for captures, we're going to do piece X for captures, which is our capture symbol, if you noticed it over here. And then it's going to be the same exact thing with our letter and then our number. Sorry, my letters are so big, but we have piece X, letter, and number. All right, so now our question is, how do we write this move? So let's take our piece, which is our queen. So we write Q, then we put in our X, and then what square are we located on? We travel all the way down. We are on the F file. We travel all the way across. We are on the 7th rank. So this would be queen takes F7. And if it weren't checkmate, that's how we would write it, right? But since it is checkmate, we're going to add in our, hashtag pound, number symbol, whatever you want to call it. And that, similarly to the check, goes at the end of the move. So this would be queen takes F7 checkmate, okay? If we hadn't taken a pawn, we would simply just take out that X, and if it wasn't checkmate, we would take out that checkmate symbol. So now the last topic we are going to cover is castling, okay? And castling has a pretty neat trick to it. So I'm going to give just some pretty straightforward random developing moves to each side so that we can have the opportunity to look at some castling. Now, here we are. Castling is, for king side, O-O and O-O-O. So that's a lot of O's to just take in all at once, okay? We don't need this anymore. That's a lot of O's to take in all at once. So why are we doing all these random O's in our position? Well, the reason is just about squares in between the king and the rooks that he wants to castle with. So if we look at our king side castle, right, the one that maybe seems more common in your games, how many squares are in between this king on E1, right? We already know the king is on the file, and we're on the 1st rank, so now we're getting so great at naming these squares, and this rook is on H1. How many squares are in between this rook and the king? 2 squares, right? And if you circle those squares, even better for us, we've got 2 big circles on these squares. So when we make this castle move, it is going to appear as O-O, okay? And that is just because of the 2 squares in between. Now, let's look at the queenside castle. Very similarly, we've got 1, 2, 3 empty squares in between this rook on A1 and this king on E1, right? Let's keep that a notation in mind. 3 squares in between. When we castle queenside, look right over here, O-O-O. So I know this is a lot of information to, maybe take in all at once. We've got our pieces. We've got how to spell them and using the first letter. We've got naming all these random squares all over the board. We've got our checks, our captures, our checkmates, and now we have our castles. But one more thing, guys, that I need to add, that is important to add. Let's go back for a second. The video cut out, but that's okay. Is how we write our pawn captures, because they are a special scenario since we do not put the P in front of them. So how are we going to capture pawns? Let's say, black decided to play pawn to D5, okay? We have our pawn on E4, right? E4 traveling up and across the board. And since the pawn starts on the E file, the first letter we're going to put is E, and then X because we're capturing, and then the square that we arrive on. So this right here is D5. So you'll see it right over here where you see my mouse is. E takes D5. We can do one more example just so we understand. Let's take this pawn right here. Our pawn starts on the A file, so we're going to start with A, X, and then this pawn right here on B5, okay? And you'll look right over here, exactly what Lee Chess is agreeing with. A takes B5. So for pawns, we don't put P like I've said before. We say the starting file that pawn is on before it captures, X, and then the square that it arrives on after it captures. So that is the end of the notation video. I know it was a lot of information like I said before, but feel free to try it out when you're going through your puzzles. Figure out what squares there are on the board, what squares you're including in your puzzles. Like if you're making a knight fork on knight f3, go, in your head, oh, that's knight f3. I would write that nf3. If you're playing games on Chess Kid, you'll see the moves out on the side of the board. Keep them in mind. If you really want to pull out a notation and start notating some of your games for practice, by all means, go for it. I hope this helped. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. Feel free to ask any of the other coaches as well. But that is the end of this video on notation. So thank you, guys.